It is the ability to build many leaders within your organization and that you're confident enough to share the leadership mantle. Now, that only works if you have a unifying vision and alignment across your team and a shared purpose. But I am of the mindset that leading together is even more powerful than the notion of a singular leader who might be all-knowing.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Welcome back to the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Today, we are delighted to bring to you one of the favorite leaders we've ever had the privilege of working with. His name is Bill Otterbeck. He is currently the Deputy Director for the Program Operations at the California Department of Healthcare Services. He's based in West Sacramento, California. And today, Bill is going to be sharing his incredibly unique gift for being able to lead large-scale transformation across some major career-defining projects. Bill, it is great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Lee.
Absolutely. This has been a long time in coming, friend. I've been thinking about it. I think we've actually known each other for about 15 years, and I think we've worked in different capacities for about 13 of those. And what I can honestly say to our listeners, Bill, is that of all the leaders I've ever worked with, you are one of the most n-dimensional leaders. And what I mean by that is when it comes to looking at patterns or challenges or opportunities that an organization might be going through, your ability to look at it from so many different lenses and to be able to connect the dots across those is just superhuman. So not all of us have that gift, but I think there might be some pieces of that we can borrow and replicate from our conversation today.
Well, thank you again for having me. I do think of myself as a lead problem solver for our department. I have an organization of 750 employees across 4 divisions. We are responsible for the Medi-Cal program provider enrollment, for claims payment. That organization pays about $24 billion in healthcare claims to Medi-Cal providers. We have our clinical assurance division, which is the utilization management program for our services. And we have the third-party liability and recovery, which does coordination of benefits and ensures that Medi-Cal is the payer of last resort. So large-scale operations, large consequence if something goes wrong. And my primary responsibility when I came into this role was to build a unifying culture between these 4 divisions. And oftentimes I got asked by the staff and by the team, like, well, we're so different as divisions. What's the rationale for bringing us together? And so we really did talk about the business of Medi-Cal and paying providers and looking at the life cycle of paying claims and how we came together across that life cycle, whether it's initially enrolling a provider or making claims payments or ensuring that services were medically necessary, and that other payers are accounted for as we make our own payments. So large-scale operations coming into the role, my job was to transform and really make us a member-focused delivery organization. So really focused on improving services for our members, making sure we were focused on the provider experience and ensuring, whether it be with provider enrollment, making sure that process was as the least cumbersome as possible and that providers could relatively easily enroll in our program. So that's been a major focus is making the program more accessible for our providers and for our members.
It's amazing the scale with what you deal with on a day to day. I mean, the rounding errors you guys have are the entire focus for many leaders out there. So I think there's some benefit of being able to see things at that macro level that can help somebody maybe running even a small business and how they look at their supply chain, whatever that equivalent is, and their customers, whatever that equivalent is. So some really neat things that you've been able to do at scale that I think inspires all of us. Well, I want to go back in time a little bit, Bill, because you have a remarkable origin story, something that I think primed this super skill of yours at a formidable age. So tell us a little bit about that history.
Sure. Well, grew up in the Bay Area in Berkeley, California. My parents are deaf, and I was the oldest child of four siblings. And I grew up largely in the deaf culture around deaf people. So my first language was American Sign Language. And as the oldest child, I got to do a lot of translating, whether it was at the grocery store, at the bank, at the gas station. As my parents were navigating, they, asked me to translate and communicate on their behalf. And it was a wonderful experience growing up. You did feel different being a child of deaf adults, but I also had that sense of purpose and meaning and how important it was for both sides of the communication interaction for them to understand each other. And I've really brought that ethic to the work that I do in government, whether it was in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, at Child Support Services, or now at Healthcare Services. I've really brought a focus on making sure that across an organization that we're well aligned, we have good lines of communication, and that we get to a point of mutual understanding in terms of business objectives or the plan for deploying a particular policy change. And, a lot of the challenges we have in large organizations are rooted in miscommunication,
A
misunderstanding.
lot. I dare say all.
Right. And so I take a lot of pride, not only myself bridging that gap, but building a culture within my team that we're looking always at the big picture, connecting the dots, and really listening carefully to our business partners, whether they're the program folks or our enterprise technology services organization, that they really have a shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And if we're solving a problem, that we both have a shared understanding of what the problem is at its root cause. And so,
Well, Bill, let's dive into that a little bit more. I want to talk first about the principle, and then maybe look at some practical examples that you're able to share. One of the things that I think you're well known for is saying we need to have a different kind of thinking about how we solve the problem than how we got into the problem. And you've characterized it as integrative thinking. Could you tell a little bit about what is that shift as a leader that you bring to do integrative thinking, and how do you invite others to join you in that shift so you can be in a position to translate as you've so well described?
yeah, well, integrative thinking starts with always keeping the big picture goal and objective in mind as we talk about the, sort of practical implications of achieving that goal. I do think back to the initial implementation of a new benefit in the Medi-Cal program around doulas, and we worked very hard on the technology implementation and getting ready to enroll doulas as a new benefit and a critical benefit for our members in addressing healthcare disparity in our communities. And what we came to understand is we could have a perfect technical implementation, but if we did not supplement that with additional communication, technical support, and a whole different level of engagement with doulas and their supportive communities, then we were not going to hit the mark. For a number of folks looking to enroll, this was a brand new experience. The notion of enrolling in a program, billing, and then getting paid for your services was very different than, a cash pay kind of environment. And so we really had to think with our program partners about doing this process very differently and having a much more robust change management training, outreach, stakeholder engagement process in order to welcome doulas into our program.
Well, and if I may, just for those listeners who might not be familiar, a doula is a type of practitioner that assists with the labor and delivery of a child. And as you mentioned, they're not they're not as traditional as some of these other medical providers and some of these other medical systems, but you're now expanding, to make the parallel to other businesses, like you're expanding your business into new customers, into new ways of operating. And the worst Hollywood movie quote ever is arguably, if you build it, they will come. Right. So like you said, you have this great technology implementation that has this great benefit that's going to be good for, the doulas. It'll be good for the members. But then just to say, here you go, that's silliness. So really being able to think more holistically about that end-to-end experience from the provider to the patient and all the pieces in between, knowing how new it would be for them is really kind of at the heart of the success for that endeavor. Great example. Just was trying to translate it for some of those who may not be speaking our particular language. Exactly.
So in terms of integrative thinking, I think the other thing I would sort of bring to this conversation is every organization has different business capabilities, finance, legal, information technology, communication, marketing, your business areas, operations. And each of them come with their own language, their own traditions and ceremony. And sometimes you need to be able to translate the different perspectives and the different bits of language so that we can get to a place of mutual understanding. And I find because operations ultimately is also an implementation organization, it's not just, the day-to-day running of the machine that pays claims. It's also implementing new policy initiatives in the transformation of the Medi-Cal program. And in doing that, we have to understand what other parts of the department are bringing to the conversation. And as we problem solve on implementation issues, and as we get ready to move forward with an initiative, we need to make sure that folks are unified in their understanding of the impact, the challenges, the risk. And that means being able to translate that into more than one language so that we can get to a place of shared understanding. And I think that's what we spend a lot of our time doing in our organization.
Yeah, no, and you've done it over and over again, where most of us might have one chance to do it in a career. You've made a career of doing it, which gives you a unique level of mastery and nuance with it, Bill. Well, would you be willing to dive in a little bit to the implementation of the statewide child support system, maybe as an example of how you got alignment on that shared vision? I mean, it seemed fairly straightforward, but it was massive on the scale. And like you said, when you stepped in, it was a place where you didn't quite have that alignment. But tell us about what that project was and what were some of the things you did to bring people together to rally around a true common cause.
My role on the single statewide child support system was to prepare for and help manage the implementation of the system in the California counties. We went through a process of designing the system, and in that process, we realized that certain functions performed by the counties, like their accounting tracking system and their employer database, as an example, needed to be managed at a centralized state level. And so we did not initially anticipate in building a statewide system that we would have to transition some of the business processes from a county business process across 58 counties to a single statewide system. And we had to do that because we needed to be able to manage the movement of accounts and information as people move from county to county. And so that meant we needed to build certain capabilities from a business function, business process perspective, like a centralized child support worker who would work on accounting, like managing a single statewide employer database so that we could reduce the number of duplicate employer records and make sure that as we were engaging with employers on child support orders, that we were doing that accurately and effectively. And that meant a level of conversation, negotiation, and engagement with the counties to understand the necessity of that change, how we were going to implement it, and then long term, really what were the benefits for the mothers and fathers and parents and children that we serve in building out these statewide capabilities. And it really was bringing it back to the customer and the end user that was so important and compelling in really asserting the value of the single statewide system. So that very much helped us overcome any short-term resistance or concerns at the time.
Well, and there was an aspect of that where you talk about the different functions of a different organization have different terminologies and different ceremonies, right? And different, phrases. And sometimes those can come with certain biases and blind spots. So there was one particular phrase that I know when you stepped in was a little bit, kind of like nails on a chalkboard for you that you kind of helped elevate and transition. And I believe it was around the non-custodial parent, right? Like what it was like getting people on board with seeing that in a different light, right? I mean, talk about like, that's the terminology. That was the technical terminology, but you changed it, maybe at a micro level. Like, what did you do to help people see the challenges with that? And how did you get them to embrace a new way of looking at that customer experience?
Well, from my perspective, and this is many years of conversations with fatherhood organizations, with child support advocate organizations, with the child support community writ large, the language that we use in the child support program is powerful. And it has impact to those who we work with and serve. And I advocated for more neutral language, parents paying support, parties receiving support, as language that would be less judgmental in its tone versus non-custodial. Because we all know that many quote unquote non-custodial parents actually have custody of their children, partial or full. And so I, communicated and worked with others to help evolve the thinking and evolve the language that we're using in the child support program. And it was a point that was important to me because it ultimately got down to respect for the people that we work with and serve in the child support program.
Well, and that's been a theme, I think, that underlies how you've been so effective across these different environments with these large scale efforts is just that, Bill. It's respect, right? You invite it, you demonstrate it, you model it, you hold yourself to that. And that creates the conditions where those miscommunications begin to be unwound, new communications built, and then new steps forward for whatever the implementation is, right? Whether it's program or policy or technology. I think that's such a core substrate to everything I've heard across your history. There's another dimension to this, Bill, you like to talk about, which is the art of making sure you're solving for the right problem. Because sometimes the symptom that presents, as leaders, we're so action oriented and we're ready to go and we start diving in and we're hacking at the wrong leaves, So tell us a little bit about either internally what you do to help yourself in those moments, make sure you don't get sucked into the solving the wrong problem, and then how also you invite others to be able to see that bigger picture and strike where really the opportunity exists.
To the extent that we're evaluating something that is an impact to the business, whether it's a defect in a system or a result of a business process that is not the intended result, What's important to me is that I get the right people from the team, potentially with divergent points of view, and for us to really have sufficient dialogue and inquiry to understand what's underneath the issue and to really poke at it and to make sure we have the right blend of technical knowledge base, but also people who can look at issues from multiple perspectives and really push on, like, are we getting to the right core issue here? And if the right people aren't in the room, making sure that we are reaching out, and whether it's someone who is at the end of the process, who's a consumer of our service, and hearing directly from them what the challenge is, or if it is someone within our IT organization or elsewhere, making sure we have the right people providing the right insights in terms of the impact so that we can problem solve and solve for the right issue. And, that's a daily occurrence for us. We're problem solving constantly. My job generally is to be at the macro level and really to be looking for emerging issues and trends so that we're issue spotting before something becomes a crisis. And, I take a lot of pride in really paying attention to the details, paying attention to something that may be an early warning sign so that we can react quickly to that rather than late and once it's become a crisis. So,
Yeah. And I think that's the ultimate goal, is to work upstream of that. I know you've not always had the luxury of that. Sometimes your expertise has been to be called upon once the proverbial stuff has hit the fan. And so, Bill, the scale of what you've been doing has been pretty remarkable. There was a point, though, when you weren't the super Bill you are today. You were just a very talented early Bill. Was there something early in your career that you learned at a crucial stage that has continued to serve you well as you've elevated and expanded your range of responsibilities?
well, sure. So I got my start in my career with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office Family Support Division. And it was there that I had the great fortune to work with a transformational leader. Her name was Maureen Lenahan, and she was the director of the office. And she really brought principles of self-directed work teams and really was one of the first leaders that I was exposed to who looked to the people actually doing the work to problem solve and suggest process improvement, process change, and then to create recommendations for that change and present them to the top leaders of the organization. And I had the great fortune of being on the first self-directed work team, and we streamlined a number of business processes. And I remember being very convinced of how good my idea was on a particular change initiative, and so I was chatting with her about that. And I think her real point to me was, well, it can't just be a singular idea, Bill's idea. You may want to get the support of others, and you may want to plant some seeds. And maybe the business folks, if they think and agree that it's a good idea, maybe ultimately it will come back to you as in part or in whole their own idea. And that's something that resonated with me over the years, because at the end of the day, what I care about is the business result and that we're achieving the outcomes and meeting our mission more so than like taking the credit for a particular idea. And in terms of building buy-in within your organization, and when an idea comes back to me as if it is someone else's idea, I think that is a win, because the organization gets the benefit of the idea. And in the meantime, it's built some grassroots support across your organization. And so that lesson has served me well over the years. And I certainly have used it to have, conversations, sometimes 100 conversations about how to change things and build a coalition of support for change in the organization. And in doing that, you're planting seeds for others to then advocate for the change that you're seeking for the team.
What stands out to me there is that when you are planting those seeds, that influence that you're trying to bring, when you're willing to let go of getting the credit for it, it actually accelerates the impact of it. And I think that's the key there, is that if you're less worried about making sure that you're cited as the source, and I think that can be hard for some leaders, especially early in their careers, because you do need to get some credit to have credibility. Like, that's not a bad thing. We're not knocking it. But if you're a leader who's known as you regularly are planting seeds and then things are coming out and happening, and magically around you, these forests are sprouting, people figure out pretty quickly that 2 and 2 is like, hey, that's actually Johnny Appleseed over there, and that then accelerates the impact, and then that helps to elevate. It's not as immediately fast, but I think in the long run, it actually goes faster. And that's kind of a paradox, but I think more leaders would benefit from embracing that. So you mentioned bringing people together with divergent thoughts and perspectives, and divergent thoughts can sometimes then manifest as conflicts. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, as you know, but it's about eliciting those perspectives to be able to, get to the source of truth and get to the root causes. Is there an example where maybe an issue that you could share? And I know some of these are pretty high profile and maybe subject to limitations on what you can share, but a situation where you brought multiple people together and that those divergent ideas at first were presenting as kind of an us, them, or some kind of conflict. And what was kind of the progression as you converted that divergence into a clear shared understanding and increased respect? Is there an example of that you can share with us?
So, in my role as Deputy Director of Program Operations, I've been at the helm of some major vendor transitions as we move from one fiscal intermediary to another. So our fiscal intermediaries are the vendors who make our Medi-Cal payments to hospitals, doctors, and other providers. And we've had some big transitions over the years. And a number of years ago, we were transitioning from one vendor conduit to another vendor, DXC, ultimately today Gainwell. And through that transition, we needed to make sure that we were operationally ready to put that into place. And there was an evaluation of the data and real debate in the department about readiness. And there were some challenges around call center readiness. And ultimately, we had to make a decision. Do we move forward with this transition and permit contracting back with the legacy vendor for a period of time so that we got a less risky transition? And we definitely had a debate around the table on our team about should we do that or not. Ultimately, we decided to move forward with the transition of the FI services, permitting the call center to be subcontracted to our new vendor. And it reduced the risk profile significantly. And ultimately, call center services a number of months later were transitioned to the new vendor. But it's an example of people earnestly had disagreements, and we had to have some healthy conflict debating, and then ultimately a decision had to be made. But what kept the debate a healthy conflict is we were focused on the issues and problem solving, not focused on people and personality. And so that is something that I continue to emphasize with my team and across our organization as we collaborate. The hard problems, we have to be focused on what is the data telling us, what are the real risks, and what are the consequences of making this decision, not on opinion, feeling, or personality. And so I think that continues to serve us well when we have that mindset.
Well, and you help to elicit that by asking really good questions, when you're trying to find what are those underlying business interests, what are the underlying performance indicators, what is the ultimate impact on our customers or members or providers. Those are things that I've seen you do that help refocus it, right? But some of the alternative standards that can be used to resolve that conflict, and they seem logical and they seem easy. But we just look at the contract, right, Bill? The contract will answer all of our questions. Or we look at the policy statement. Well, the policy says, therefore, our hands are tied. And you're like those are good points of input, right? But I think what you've done really well is learn how to translate that input, compare it to the real data, the real risks, and the real underlying interest, and say, what's the true best path forward? That takes a different way of looking at it.
Right. Well, and for me, if in a vendor relationship, your first instinct is to go to the contract and stay, squarely within the four corners of the contract, to me, the real conversation is, are we getting the business result and the business value that we contracted for? And that's not always absolutely pristinely clear in service level agreements and other performance indicators, and making sure that there is alignment between the vendor and the state on what is valuable and what is the level of customer service that is required and demanded in this service delivery. That's what I keep on coming back to in our vendor management kinds of conversations, where we're talking about how are we refining the services, how are we improving them? Because the moment you're static in your service delivery and you're not thinking about how to improve and innovate, there's an inherent degradation of service there. And so I always want to push for improvement, whether it's efficiency, process improvement, or in how we are meeting the customer, whether member, provider, or other customer.
Well, and you mentioned how you've done that internally with your internal partners within the organization, but you've also done that externally. You've often, in those vendor management relationship conversations, you're often working with the COO or the CEO to be able to help them see how their interests would align with maybe looking at things in a different perspective. Any tips for a mid-level business leader who might be in a conversation, maybe not at the scale you are, but when you're showing up to those kind of conversations, what are you focused on when you're trying to influence, a key vendor for you to help them be part of your success? Any tips you could share there?
I'm always interested in what motivates behavior in human beings. And the same is true in what motivates vendors. And, every vendor has a profit and loss they're managing to, and a revenue stream they are charged with, achieving. And I do listen very carefully for their pain points, and I try and understand what's important to them, not just the folks on the ground, but the folks from corporate on up. And the more you pay attention and listen to the things that are of concern to them, then you can build that into your own strategy for managing them from a vendor management perspective. And from my perspective, there's nothing worse than being out of alignment with your vendor, because we can't get maximum business value if they're out of alignment and in a poor place in terms of revenue recognition or other aspects of their operations. If their costs,
it could be reputational, right? It could be a control perspective. That's just one example. But I like how you share that, because that applies to almost any influencing relationship. Looking to see it again, not just from your perspective, but as you did so well for your parents, looking at it through their perspective, the perspective of the gas station attendant, right? And being able to see, is this a reputation thing? Is this a control thing? Is this a revenue thing? Is this a contribution thing? And being able to then say, oh, well, I know how to speak that language. And then showing, here's what we could do to make those things align. I mean, it is the most practical application of true compassionate listening as a leader, right? You got to listen first to know what those drivers are, and then you just focus on it.
In listening doesn't mean that you agree, but it means that it does mean that you seek to understand and incorporate their motivation into how you are going to respond back. And, every day there are disagreements between our vendors in our leadership, but how you navigate that to a place of hopefully alignment, but at a minimum common understanding of what we're trying to achieve here, that's what's important. So as long as we're listening to each other, there is a foundation for resolving issues. The moment you stop listening, that's when you start to get into conflict that is unproductive.
Yeah, it's unrecoverable. So maybe as a takeaway for our listeners, the next time they're either with internal partners, right? It's marketing versus finance or whatever the thing is, or maybe it's you with a vendor. When you sense disagreement, what I'm hearing you suggest is that's the invitation. That's not the end of alignment. That is the beginning of seeking to understand. And if we're willing to see things through a different perspective, whether we agree with them or not, right? As long as we can understand them, then we have the ability to translate, find some communication that might move us forward. And if we decide after that we don't, that's okay. And then we can end the relationship in a purposeful way. But let's not just prematurely prevent us from achieving our results just because we happen to speak a different language. So Bill, you've had this remarkable journey in your career. What's at the forefront of your thoughts as you think about some of these transformations take multiple generations of leaders, and how do you kind of embed it in the organization so that you're enhancing collaboration across generations of leaders?
So I did want to talk a little bit about the fact that at least in state government, every 10 years, 30% of our workforce is retiring or leaving. And the ability to retain and develop domains of knowledge are even more pressing and important in managing the business and making sure we have the institutional knowledge available to us. And I've really thought about that a lot in the context of collaboration and shared learning. And I'm reading a book currently called Collaboration by Morton Hansen. He is a professor at University of California, Berkeley, and works with Apple University. And I had the great pleasure of listening to him at Apple Park talk about collaboration that was unique to Apple. And in thinking about collaboration, one of the interesting things to me is he talked about barriers to collaboration, and one of them being your particular business area. If it's not invented or created in your area, then getting input from outside might be resisted. And that there might be a hoarding of information, like knowledge is power, and keeping that power, there may be some self-interest in that. That knowledge may not be easy to find in an organization. It may be hidden away or in individuals, and institutionally, it may not be easy to access. And lastly, the most complex knowledge for complex problem solving is not necessarily easily transferable from one business unit to another. And so I just raised this from the vantage point of I am thinking about how we collaborate differently within our organization so that we can develop areas of knowledge, not just within a particular team or business unit or division, but how we can share that knowledge more broadly and build capacity. And so we've talked a lot about building domains of knowledge and how we would share that knowledge across our organization. And from my perspective, it just begs for a different way of working together. And so really that's at the forefront of our thinking as we're thinking about innovating how we accomplish our work and how we work with our business partners. What's at the core of that conversation is, what is our collaboration model? What does it need to look like going forward? And how do we partner, particularly with the business, at every step of the development of a business initiative? And so I would encourage others to think about how you're collaborating and where you're working together in a more insular way. How do you break through those silos of work to work together differently? That's at the forefront of our thinking, and I just encourage others to be intentional about how to problem solve in that way.
Wonderful. So, Bill, where can folks find out more about you, follow you on your progression as you're continuing to be a mega problem solver and a great collaborator internally and externally to organizations that you lead?
Well, I welcome anyone to connect with me on LinkedIn, and always happy to have a conversation. So feel free to reach out, and happy to do a Teams meeting or connect through some other platform. Would welcome the conversations.
Great. So yeah, you guys, the next time you're in a really contentious multi-billion-dollar sticky spot, make sure you tab Bill Otterbeck on your LinkedIn. Bill, it has been a privilege to have worked with you, to be able to witness the compassionate, the strategic, and the very focused leadership that you've provided. Appreciate you taking some time out of your very busy schedule to share some of these nuggets with other leaders in the early, middle, or even late parts of their careers as they wrestle with transformation at scale. Thanks again for being on the show.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.